of Scotland, they changed back to floats for the final challenge, the Atlantic crossing by way of Iceland, and then on to Newfoundland and Labrador. On the first Atlantic leg, another cruiser crashed, but its crew was rescued. The two surviving crews clambered ashore onto American soil to a warm welcome. But this was small compared to the greetings they were to receive on their journey across the United States, culminating in a tremendous reception at Seattle, where their adventure began. To start with, it was the pilots of the Army Air Corps who flew the mail. But soon private companies began to compete for post office contracts. A new hero now entered the public imagination, the mail pilot, whose exploits fired the enthusiasm of a younger generation of flyers.
Let's go. Well, as a boy 11 years old, working at Sid Chaplin Aerodrome, South Hollywood, going out to the field after school on our bicycles, my brother and I, we got acquainted with some of the pilots. And so from then, we kept working around the airport, wiping wings, pulling chocks, oiling rocker arms, and the next 2 years, we were all eyes, like a dog in a sausage factory. We were
Choke on, switch off.
Choke on, switch off.
Choke off.
Choke off.
Contact.
Contact.
Why, my idea was to fly the mail because I could fly, and I'd hear these stories about these intrepid mail pilots on the Midwest from Omaha to San Francisco and going across to Washington. This is before passenger lines were flying and before Lindbergh flew to Paris. I couldn't wait to get back and start flying the mail. Looking out from 1,500 feet high and doing 80 miles an hour, fastest we'd ever been, and hearing the wind whistling and so forth, and smelling even some of the gas fumes coming back and watching those rocker arms on the front of the engine. From then on, that was it. We had finally reached a point where when we knew we were going to stay in these airplanes, that was all there was to it. And it was it's been so many years ago. It's been 60-some years ago.
Before the coming of the airmail, it took almost a week for a letter to cross the country. Once regular transcontinental mail flights were inaugurated, it took just 2 days.
The early mail pilots were he-men. They were rough and ready, but lovable fellows who were in the thing because it was a new and dangerous business. Before the navigation aids had been installed, they had to learn their route like a book. Every hill, tree, and river, and village, to guide themselves in all kinds of weather.
It'll be a beautiful day, no passengers, no nothing else but just you and the mail and God. You'd get down, you'd fly low, and I'd say, gee, what day is this? I'm enjoying flying, and oh, yeah, there's Miss Fuller's farmhouse. I used to see it from 6,000 feet. I'm right down over the top and go by. And they'd be out waving, and the laundry would be out hanging on the line. I'd say, hey, gee, yeah, that must be Monday. Monday's wash day.
I used to drop a newspaper off to my sister. She lived on a farm right on the route between Iowa City and Chicago. And I used to drop her a newspaper every time I fly over. Today, you'd be 5 or 6 miles up in the air, and if you dropped a newspaper, it'd probably land in England. You couldn't do that today.
As time went on, we acquired more knowledge. There was primitive flying. We'd push our luck sometimes in order to make a good point for the company that had the contract mail carriers. So there were many flights. I look back at them now that I feel a little bit fortunate that I'm here.
It was subsidies from the post office that launched and sustained the airmail. In time, these subsidies led to corruption and scandal. But without them, the U.S. airmail would never have kept flying. In Britain, it was the vast size of its empire that attracted the trailblazer. In 1925, Alan Cobham set off from Croydon near London on a long-distance flight to survey potential routes for the recently formed Imperial Airways. His destination, Cape Town, an 8,000-mile journey down the length of Africa. His companions, a film cameraman and a mechanic.
One had no meteorological reports. They couldn't even telephone up ahead to find out what it was like. So you flying into the unknown as far as weather was concerned. You might meet low cloud, you might meet a snowstorm, you might meet a dust storm, but you never knew what was ahead of you.
One is amazed how on earth he ever found these strips, which the local men had cleared in the jungle, but find them he did with a compass. No radar or any of those fancy things, a straightforward compass, and you just steered by looking over the top of the compass and said it must be about there. And somehow or other you found it and landed on this strip. And there, this local commissioner would meet you, and there would be men posted about the airplane. I mean, animals really was what you were protecting the airplane from, in case they did any damage to it while it stayed there overnight. The organization that must have gone into these trips is interesting. The trip round Africa would have involved fantastic transportation problems. Cans of petrol have to be there waiting. You have to have made arrangements for that fuel to have been ferried up there, possibly by canoe and so on. The local natives come out to actually beat the land down with their feet and make the runway firm enough for father to be able to take off. Because you can see before they do this, there's one wheel sunk in the mud, and clearly he would not be able to get off at all. Thousands of people turn out and welcome this pioneer from England. I should think some of them thought, this madman from England, and if you look at the country that had been traversed, you're inclined to agree with some of them as well.
London to Cape Town in 3 months. One of Cobham's many trailblazing flights across the British Empire.
By that method, he really opened the Empire Airlines step by step, long before there were airlines capable of doing it. These flights had tremendous publicity. The newspapers of England and often of many other places in the world publicized the story, building him up as a great man, and people were enormously interested. He was the pop idol of the day.
Cobham might have convinced the public with his epic flights, but he still had to persuade the British government. To win them over, when he flew back from Australia, he took his case straight to Parliament by landing on the Thames at Westminster.
Lord Birkenhead replied, you see, after I'd given my impassioned speech on having an air route to India immediately. And he said, the present moment, when I send a dispatch to India, I say, thank God I can't get a reply under 2 months. Now Cobham is going to have a reply in a week. Life will be unbearable. We don't want airlines.
For the determined aviator, the world still abounded in challenges. The aim of American explorer Commander Richard Byrd was to fly over the South Pole. From the start, appalling conditions delayed the attempt. The crew had to spend the winter in the Antarctic. Byrd's aircraft was a Ford trimotor, and to protect it from the intense cold, the team had to improvise an unusual hangar. Three years earlier, Byrd had successfully overflown the North Pole. Now he and his companions spent the dark winter months of 1929 holed up in their base camp, preparing for their attempt on the South Pole. Spring arrived at last, and with it, suitable weather. The first task was to dig out the trimotor and see if it had survived its hibernation. On November 28th, the trimotor, named the Floyd Bennett after Byrd's companion on his North Pole flight, took off with its crew of 4. Ahead lay a round trip of 1,600 miles, and little chance of rescue if they had to come down on the way. Fuel started to look dangerously low, so the crew threw out everything they could spare to light the airplane. At last, almost 10 hours into the flight, Commander Byrd reached 90 degrees south, the first man to fly over both poles. In the Himalayas, aviators found another challenge: Everest, the world's highest peak.
Fresh western disturbance causing cloudy conditions frontier and western Himalayas.
In 1933, a British team led by the Marquis of Clydesdale arrived on the northern plains of India, determined to be the first to fly over the 29,000-foot summit.
Increasing height up to about 100 miles per hour at 9 and 10. Oh, that's a complete washout.
Like Byrd, they had to wait for months for the right weather conditions. Storm clouds and strong winds over the mountains delayed the attempt.
Sergeant Greenwood, we've decided to go. Get the machines out and stand by to start up the engine.
Very few people had been over 30,000 feet. But there was worldwide interest in achieving the height record. And to that end, the French had had a stab at it, the Italians had held the record, and recently the Americans. So high flying was a fairly unknown subject.
2 Westland aircraft had been shipped out from England. They had been stripped down to the barest essentials to make them as light as possible. A special blend of fuel, tetraethyl lead, had been developed to cope with temperatures that could drop to minus 60 degrees centigrade.
Very special suits of 4-ply material were constructed and fitted with a very elaborate system of heating elements throughout, including boots and flying helmets. That in turn required large electric power, and therefore big generators had to be fitted to the machine. The helmets were similarly heated, and even the goggles and a face mask had their electrical elements.
The people of India treated the Himalayas as something sacred. They felt very definitely that if these gods were disturbed, that all sorts of queer things would happen to them. They'd never seen an airplane before in their lives.
The teams were also experimenting with cameras and film at low temperatures and great altitude.
There was no possible place to land. And of course, once you'd got sufficient height to get up over Everest, you were well out of gliding distance of the Indian Plains. And had there been an engine failure, you couldn't possibly have flown back. The observer, Bonnet, was taking pictures, and each time he changed a plate, he had to go back into the cockpit. And on one of these occasions, he trod on his flexible metal oxygen pipe. And then when he stood up, the pipe parted company.
Without oxygen at that height, Bonnet would not have survived. But quick thinking on his part saved him, and the planes went on to fly over the summit.
He'd been working with his camera for a little bit longer, and then he began to pass out, and did eventually collapse completely into the bottom of the cockpit. The pilot couldn't do anything about this because there was the two separate cockpits.
The flight was a success, but as the cameramen had passed out, both aircraft flew the mission again 3 days later so their achievement could be properly filmed. Adventures like these captured the headlines. More significant for commercial aviation was the challenge to fly non-stop between the cities of New York and Paris, a competition that reached its peak some years earlier, at a tragic cost. In 1926, French aviator René Fonck and his crew were ready to try for the $25,000 Ortig Prize, offered for the first successful crossing. The problem all these Atlantic challengers faced was the weight of the fuel that they had to carry. The critical moment was takeoff, when the load was heaviest. In the flames that engulfed Fonck's Sikorsky aircraft, 2 of his 5-man crew died. Undeterred, a queue of contenders joined the race to cross the Atlantic. Clarence Chamberlain and Lloyd Berthoud began in style, but saw their hopes fall flat when their landing gear broke on a test flight. Commander Byrd was also among the hopefuls. An unfortunate landing postponed his challenge. American pilots Davis and Wooster were preparing for their attempt. On the final test, their tanks heavy with fuel, the aircraft became difficult to control. Soon after takeoff, it plunged into the ground. Both men were killed. From Europe came an attempt in the reverse direction, against the prevailing winds. French ace Charles Nougessor and his co-pilot Francois Colly set off from Le Bourget near Paris, heading west over the Atlantic. The aircraft named the White Bird and its 2 pilots were never seen again. Enter the next challenger, a converted Ryan aircraft named Spirit of St. Louis. 25-year-old Charles Lindbergh had persuaded some St. Louis businessmen to sponsor his bid. On May 20th, 1927, he was ready for the challenge that had cost so many lives.
Lindbergh was a dreamer. Certainly as an Air Mare pilot, he had as much experience at flying without great assistance from aides on the ground. And so he couldn't resist the opportunity to participate in the race. He was not an extrovert. He was a very conservative character, but not too conservative to try the Atlantic.
Lindbergh would have to fly the journey blind, relying on a periscope or leaning out of the window to see what lay ahead. An extra-large fuel tank had been fitted directly in front of the cockpit between the wings for the best center of gravity. It completely cut off the view forward.
Brakes in contact!
Today, Lindbergh's Spirit is not forgotten. Piloted by enthusiasts, this replica flies regularly, and Lindbergh's own experience of the epic adventure lives on in his writings.
What a beautiful machine it is, in front of the hangar, trim and slender, gleaming in its silver coat. All our ideas, all our calculations, all our hopes lie there before me, waiting to undergo the acid test of flight. For me, it seems to contain the whole future of aviation. When such planes can be built, there's no limitation to the air. My cockpit quivers with the engine's tenseness. Sharp explosions from the exhaust stacks speak with confidence and precision. But the Spirit of St. Louis isn't vibrant with power as it's always been before. I'm conscious of the great weight pressing tires into the ground, of the fragility of wings, of the fullness of oversized tanks of fuel. There is in my plane this morning more of earth and less of air than I've ever felt before. I'm alone at last, over the first short stretch of sea on the route to France. The surface is calm. There's hardly a sign of movement beneath the oil-smooth sheen of its skin. It's only 35 miles to the Connecticut shore, but I've never flown across that much water before. I relax in my cockpit, this little box with fabric walls in which I'm to ride across the ocean. Now, if all goes well, I won't move from it for a day and a half until I step out on French sod at the airport of Le Bourget. There's room enough, no more, no less. My cockpit's been tailored to me like a suit of clothes. Instrument readings are all normal. The engine sounds smoother than at the beginning of the flight. Possibly it's simply the smoothness a well-cared-for engine gains during the early hours of its life. Whatever the cause, there's something in its rhythm that assures me and gives me confidence with which to enter the unknown space ahead, to climb up over the fog, over the sea, and into the night. It seems impossible to go on longer. All I want in life is to throw myself down flat, stretch out, and sleep. I've got to find some way to keep alert. There's no alternative but death and failure. No alternative but death and failure, I keep repeating, using the thought as a whip on my lagging mind, trying to make my senses realize the importance of what I'm saying.
After 33.5 hours, the Spirit of St. Louis reached Paris.
It's only 100 yards to the hangars now. It would be better to come in straight, but if I don't side-slip, I'll be too high over the boundary to touch my wheels in the area of light. Not a bad landing. I start to taxi back toward the floodlights and hangars, but the entire field ahead is covered with running figures.
It seemed as if all Paris had turned out to greet him. With one flight, he had become a legend, joining the select group of aviation's pioneers, like Louis Blériot. On his return to America, his reception was no less triumphant. Everywhere he went, he drew an ecstatic welcome.
Lindbergh became the symbol of flight. And he was young, he was handsome, and he was taciturn, and he was a kind of an ideal hero. Lindbergh captured the